Hi, and welcome to our review of modernism, in particular modernist poetry. This will be the culmination of week 4 as we transition into week 5, which is also modernism, and we do some poetry there, but we also are going to be dealing with some short fiction. A number of you have expressed some desire to get together and discuss concepts related to the midterm. I will be sending out a midterm study guide, and I also am trying to set up some times, possibly on Friday around 7 p.m. A lot of you have said that time works for you, and or we might be possibly doing another session in the week, the next week, the following week on Thursday. The midterm is really just a series of prompts that you'll be responding to based on the readings that we've done. It will be open note and open book. You will not be able to use the internet or any of the, I guess you'd say, technologically located sources that we've used in the class, like YouTube and other things, but you can use your notes and, of course, your books. As far as the midterm goes, it really shouldn't take you more than an hour. You'll have a series of short answers. I'm expecting about a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs for each of those. And as we've mentioned, you want to make sure that those are fully realized, i.e., you have a main idea, evidence, analysis, and that link that connects it all kind of back. Now, with modernism, you guys have spent some time with the big names in modernism, which are Pound and Eliot. You've also spent some time with Moore, Marianne Moore, and you've kind of explored some of these concepts related to modernism. The modern period of literature really is kind of after 1911. It's usually also roughly affiliated with World War I, kind of that disjuncture of continuity in history and decorum and manners, etc. It's not so much that something is bad, but there's definitely a strong and conscious break with tradition. And that strong and conscious break with tradition is definitely something you're going to want to keep in mind as you continue to read the fiction and poetry for this week, week 5. Modernism really kind of breaks down to 4 pillars of thought and kind of the way that we've learned to deal with them. The first one, of course, is that man is in control of his world and the way that he sees the world. And right during the turn of the century, we saw a break in the psychoanalytic thought with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, telling us that we had no more control of our minds than we did have control of whether the sun rises or sets, that it is part of our subconscious and unconscious. And this was the first pillar to kind of really knock down. Up to this point, there was a sense that we had control over our soul or control over our mind. And Jung and Freud really broke that. 2 was more of a placing of us as a divine being, or at least made in the image of divinity. And we can see that with Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, that sense of natural or kind of that kind of sense of the divine within was really kind of catapulted and broken down. So we have Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's effect on the mind. We have Charles Darwin's theories about the evolution and the transition of mankind. Our third one really does reflect more towards the philosophers and or religion. We had a number of philosophers come to rise during this period that really did counter these kind of classical thoughts that had so long dominated, or even the Enlightenment period thinkers. With the existentialists in France, also appearing later, but also starting their foothold now, and of course with Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which proclaimed loudly that God is dead, not God in the sense of the divine, but God in the sense of our understanding as a social construct is gone. We can no longer believe in this sense that really disenfranchised us from our faith. And of course the last was in science with Heisenberg, Einstein, and any number of different theorists that did show us that the building blocks of our universe were actually able to be manipulated and used for the ultimate weapon, which of course is the atomic bomb. So you have these 4 kind of areas of our world being affected, and of course you also have at the same time World War I going on, which was a highly mechanized and depersonalized war. You had the standardization of time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where your time was no longer your own. And so you have a lot of things that people are bumping up against. And this idea is of a historical discontinuity. There's a sense of alienation, of exile, a lack of comfort in the traditions, a lack of epistemological and ontological certainty. And this is a very, I guess you'd say, expressive time period also. In the arts, you have less about representing faithfully what's going on, more about presenting this kind of almost filter of the presentation. And in our textbook, which we are now in volume D, you will see that there's actually a really good presentation of art. We have Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase. We have Hartley, we have Motley, we have George O'Keeffe. We have a number of artists in here that also reflect these modern sensibilities. There is, of course, some other things that we can look at when we talk about modernism, and we, of course, will get into those conversations as we transition into our short fiction and our fiction. I did want to mention that there were some great observations in our discussion boards, and I can see that your responses to your peers are getting much more robust. I did think that a lot of you expressed this sense of tension with poetry, and reading poetry is its own little animal. So I understand that tension. I like that, you know, that a lot of you did mention that poetry really was something that you didn't feel comfortable with, but that by rereading it and working it through, you became more comfortable. Hattie mentioned that poetry is the land of symbols, of imagery, and wordplay. And that is an excellent model to use in your mind, that you need to look for images, for symbols, and for the play of words, the punning. I also see that Jerry mentioned this difficulty, but that he found through reading and rereading it that he became more comfortable with the subject matter. Joe L. had a great overview of modernism. I urge you to take a look at his discussion posting because it's absolutely, it captures a good kernel of that. We also had Kimberly mentioned that she likes to read poetry rather than short stories, which is just good. Michael said that he felt a connection to the poetry, and he related this connection to the poetry just as much as he relates to music of this time period. And that is kind of where you want to think about it with poetry, is that this is in many ways just like the poetry of our times is often formed as music. The poetry of this time was written as text. Michelle mentioned that poetry reflects a sense of the imagination, which does also reflect into modernism. Naya mentioned that she writes poetry, but she also hates poetry, so there's that tension that we see. Prinzetta mentioned the imagination, much like Michelle mentioned. Rachel mentioned that the poetry brought out emotions and created a sense of communication, emotional communication with it. Raymond offered the advice of reading poetry and reading it slowly. And then, you know, Vera mentioned that that the modern was also very romantic and gave more as one of our examples. I do know that many of you did find that Marilyn Moore's poetry was something that you enjoyed. Moore was one of the leading American poets of this time period. She does offer a substantial difference between both Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Moore is really focusing on that division between woman and poet. She really did influence the next generation of American poets, which you're going to be reading, such as Elizabeth Bishop and Gwendolyn Brooks. And she did also influence, of course, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. She thinks about the idea of experience from the filter of being a woman, but she also thinks of it from being a poet. She does want to reinvent poetry for herself. She wants to find a new way of expressing herself in poetry. And I can see that some of you mentioned that. Althea mentioned that Moore's poetry as complex, but it does show this continuous stream of thought. And stream of thought is one of the hallmarks of the modern poet and modern fiction writer. Angela mentioned that in Moore, she thought that Moore wasn't really a big fan of poetry, which is true. She is very much in this tension between being a woman and being a poet. And Angela also mentioned that in Moore's writing that it appears that there are important things that can be found within the poem itself, that it can be unearthed. We also had from Deborah W. That Moore was one of the more enjoyable poets of this reading. And a lot of you did express a sense of enjoyment with Moore. Justin quoted the idea that from Moore that we don't admire what we cannot understand, which is a great sensibility for this week's reading. Michelle mentioned that Moore was a difficult read, and that there was this tension in the love, kind of a modern sense. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Vera pulled out these kind of romantic elements from Moore. Moore was probably pretty accessible. I know a number of you did read Ezra Pound's In the Station of the Metro and, of course, The River Merchant's Wife, and both of those kind of really caused you to pause and think, especially with the idea of the In the Station of a Metro, which was only 16 words, so it's very short. Most of you mentioned in regards to In the Station of Metro, starting with Lauren, had a great response to Joe, where she mentioned In the Station of the Metro really is something, a poem that has more than meets the eye, which is exactly that image that you want to capture. Adrian mentioned from The River Merchant's Wife that the story is really one that is captured in a poem, but it is still a story. There's still a narrative. April mentioned that even in those 2 lines in the Station of the Metro, there's a sense of sadness and darkness that pervades. Which Betty pulled that same kind of sense of feeling, that sense of emotion, into her reading of The River Merchant's Wife, which this idea of using evidence that's never returned to capture the sense. Carmen also suggested that the narrative of The River Merchant's Wife really made it easier to connect with than the others. Charles E. mentioned that shorter isn't always better, you know, but he did enjoy the poem because even with 1 word, sometimes 1,000 words won't even do what 1 word would do. We also had the idea from Gwendolyn that our past can determine our present, which pulled in a bridge between all of the poems that we read. Jeremy mentioned that Pound was very similar to Paul from Corinthians 13:11. You know, that kind of we lay past our youth and our experience and our ideas as a child to become more of an adult. Both Joe P. and Joshua had a great reading of In the Station of the Metro, with Joe P. mentioning that the work cannot be easily overlooked. Lacey mentioned that In the Station of the Metro demonstrated imagism, which is another key component in modernism. And then Monica mentioned that modernism fits into this one-sentence poem in a very clever way. And I think you want to think of Pound kind of different than you want to think of Eliot. Eliot wants to capture an encyclopedic view of the experience. He wants to capture everything that has happened thus far in this kind of Fisher King-esque, The Wasteland in particular. Where Pound's not trying to capture an encyclopedia. Pound is trying to translate the experience. So it's with Eliot, it's transcribing and kind of putting forth this kind of capturing, and with Pound it's translating. It's more of a series of dictionaries than it is a series of encyclopedias. And with Eliot, you probably got a lot of Eliot in the discussion, as you did with Pound. And Eliot really is trying to capture both the classical allusions, interweaving references to Renaissance painters, quoting, pulling in this kind of consciousness. And most of you mentioned this in your explorations of the wasteland. Brandy mentioned that the wasteland really connects beyond just one thing, but she focused on the brother and the father passing her interpretation of one of the sections. Charles T. really captured it very clearly by stating that the wasteland is all about the 20th century, which it is. Chastity, I'm not sure why she mentioned it, but she said the wasteland was short, which I think it's fairly long, but maybe there was another reading that was confused in there. Christopher G. mentioned that he loved the sense of loneliness that pervaded from the poem. Corwin, much like we talked about with the encyclopedic knowledge of the wasteland, mentioned that it had many references. Daniel liked the structure of the work, you know, that sense of movement through England, through London. You know, April is the cruelest month blooming, then going through the various game of chess, and that you have a lot of richness there, ending with that kind of almost chant that does refer back to a sense of the Buddhist or the Hindu religion. Jeffrey mentioned that it captures a sense of the human experience. It shows a picture of understanding. And Deborah, much like most of us, expressed the need for a guide. And the wasteland does need to have sometimes a guide through it, your own Tiresias, per se. We also had from Ronaldo that the wasteland was very confusing, but notes kind of could assist it in making it an understandable text. I think you want to remember that Eliot combines mythology and legend, anthropology, classical literature, Shakespeare, Wagner, the tarot, comparative religious culture. He thinks about isolation, fragmentation, uncertainty, and waste. And those are some other of those 4 areas that I mentioned to you, those historical areas. Those ideas of isolation, fragmentation, uncertainty, and waste are also definitely embedded in the modern sensibility. Now, as you prepare yourself to transition into these next readings, you'll be reading Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and of course Sherwood Anderson, and then you'll be reading some more of the poetry. So I do definitely want you to go forward looking to see these different 4 historical moments, looking for isolation, looking for fragmentation, looking for a sense of disjuncture. But at the same time, a reliance on symbolism, which is, you're going to see by the time we get to postmodernity, that's kind of gone away. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And like I said, I will be emailing out an overview of the midterm, and we will be planning a study session, possibly on Friday. Thank you so much, and have a great day.